Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we distill the complex world of global competition and strategic thinking into clear, usable knowledge. Today, we're really going to dig into the very foundation of national security, basically the logical framework that connects political purpose to military action. If you've ever wondered how a massive country like the United States decides when, where, and how to apply its power, well, this is for you.
That's absolutely right. We are dissecting the machinery of national strategy, the complex how that links national policy, which really represents the political ends, with the totality of national power, which you can think of as the means. Our discussion today draws heavily from some foundational stuff. We're looking at U.S. military doctrine, specifically Joint Publication 1, Volume 1, Joint Warfighting, and also Harry R. Yarger's The Little Book on Big Strategy, fantastic insights there, plus key academic work like David Jablonsky's National Power, and we'll bring in some international relations theory context from Stephen McGlinchey's Foundations of International Relations.
Okay, so our mission today is to give you, our listeners, a kind of shortcut to understanding this specific process the U.S. uses, how it navigates global competition and sometimes conflict. Because it's not just about having more resources than the other guy, right? A nation needs to understand how to actually leverage those resources effectively to get what it wants politically without taking on, well, unacceptable risk.
Exactly. And that calculation, the strategic thinking, it has to start with a really clear definition. Yarger, in the Little Book on Big Strategy, he puts it very well. He defines strategy as, fundamentally, the disciplined calculation of objectives, concepts, and resources, all measured within acceptable risk, designed to create more favorable future outcomes than you might otherwise get. At the national level, this forced you to realize immediately that all those elements of national power, they're just resources. Resources that have to be applied toward achieving those political policy ends. So it's a political function before it's a military one.
Yeah, I think that connection is maybe the most critical starting point. The military is, incredibly powerful, but it's a subordinate resource in the grand scheme. It doesn't set the goal. It carries out the plan to achieve the goal that the political leadership sets.
Precisely. And U.S. doctrine makes this relationship crystal clear. National policy, that's the broad guidance from the national government. It's pursuing national strategic objectives, things tied to fundamental values and interests. That's the big picture, the national aspiration, if you like.
So if that's the big picture aspiration, then military strategy is kind of the action arm for that policy. Joint doctrine really stresses that its purpose is unequivocally to serve national policy. It tries to achieve those policy aims by, well, maintaining or maybe changing things in the strategic environment, the global landscape, to help the national interest.
Right. And to manage something that immense, you obviously need a structure, a systematic way to make sure everyone's pulling in the same direction, all of the government agencies, the entire armed forces. And that's where this hierarchical framework comes in. It creates a sort of cascade of strategies, providing specific, aligned direction right down to the joint force. It ensures everything flows consistently from the president down to, say, the soldier in the field. Yarger points out this nested hierarchy helps with command and control, and crucially, ensures the objectives set at each level are actually appropriate for that level.
Okay, let's unpack this cascade then, because it sounds like the blueprint for how the nation gets organized for competition. So at the very top, the political peak, you have the national security strategy. This is the big one, usually from the president, providing the ultimate ends. It's designed to align all the instruments of national power, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, towards one unified vision. Basically telling the nation what matters most.
Following that foundational document comes the National Defense Strategy. This one's issued by the Secretary of Defense. And it takes those broad national security interests and translates them into more concrete, prioritized defense objectives, specifically for the Department of Defense. It really addresses how the military part needs to be structured, trained, equipped, and, employed to protect the nation and its allies.
And then we go down another level, right? To the National Military Strategy, developed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So if the defense strategy says what defense objectives are important, the military strategy describes how the armed forces will actually support those objectives. This is where it gets really focused on. The military means the capabilities, the force structure, the operational concepts needed to execute that defense strategy.
Exactly. And finally, this whole structure gets put into action regionally by the combatant commanders. They develop detailed theater strategies. These strategies apply all that national level guidance within their specific geographic area or sometimes functional area of responsibility. The beauty of this framework really is that every action, whether it's a huge deployment or just a small training exercise, should be traceable back up that chain, ensuring it links back to the original political purpose laid out in the national security strategy.
That clarity is vital, yeah. But it also highlights something you mentioned earlier. The military is just one piece of the puzzle. Real strategy needs the whole government's strength, coordinating what the doctrine calls the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic instruments of national power. We often hear the term DIME for that diplomatic, informational, military, economic, the whole of government approach.
Mm-hmm. And that coordination is centrally managed, orchestrated really, by the National Security Council. Their job is to integrate these different instruments to achieve those national objectives. Because if you fail to coordinate, one hand ends up undermining the other, which is just disastrous for strategic success.
Let's look a bit closer at those instruments, those means. Starting with the diplomatic one, usually led by the Department of State. Joint doctrine says diplomacy is about using relationships, activities, engaging other nations, building coalitions, getting foreign support. But here's a key strategic point, right? Military power often provides the muscle behind the diplomacy. The president, the diplomats, they negotiate from a position of strength because the option of military force is credible, it's visible.
Yeah. The military instrument is distinct. Its fundamental purpose, as defined in doctrine, is winning the nation's wars. But just as critical, maybe even more so today, is deterring conflict from happening in the first place. It's the instrument of last resort for actual forcible action, sure, but it's also used constantly across what they call the competition continuum for things like assuring allies, showing commitment, providing that credible deterrent to potential adversaries, or sometimes creating leverage for coercion.
Then there's the economic instrument.
Yeah.
Very powerful. This uses commerce, trade, sanctions, foreign aid, basically tools to advance your own goals, or sometimes to constrain another nation's prosperity or power. We see this really clearly with things like sanctions, trade restrictions, or even big foreign aid packages designed to influence behavior. Departments like Commerce and Treasury are key here, working with state and defense to, target and pressure adversaries using financial and economic levers.
And finally, the informational instrument. This is a tricky one. Sometimes it's described as the environment where everything else happens, but it's really where the battle of narratives plays out. The struggle for legitimacy, cyberspace operations fit in here too. It's about influencing populations, building support for your actions, and countering the misinformation and propaganda your adversaries are pushing out. And because we live in such a connected world, the effectiveness of the diplomatic, military, and economic tools often really depends on whether the informational instrument has successfully, prepared the ground, shaped the narrative.
It really sounds like the core takeaway here is integration. Yeah. Military action alone, well, it might be necessary sometimes, but it's rarely going to be enough to achieve those big strategic goals without the calculated support and orchestration of the other three. Okay, so once we start talking about using these instruments, we hit a really fundamental concept, something David Jablonsky highlights in his work on national power. Power is always relative. It's never absolute. You can't just, add up your resources on a spreadsheet and declare yourself the winner.
That idea of relativity is absolutely key for any strategic assessment. Jablonsky really forces the strategist to ask, power over whom and with respect to what objectives? If you only measure your own power in a vacuum, looking inward, you're almost guaranteed to miscalculate badly.
That famous example, the historical one about France in 1939, it really drives this point home, doesn't it? If you just looked at France's military resources back then, their tanks, troop numbers, the Maginot Line, quantitatively, maybe even qualitatively, they look stronger than their own winning army from 1919. They looked strong on paper.
But, as Jablonsky argues, that apparent strength is meaningless unless you measure it against the adversary. Relative to Nazi Germany, France was critically weak. Not necessarily weak in resources, but weak in doctrine in their approach. Germany had adopted a revolutionary military concept, blitzkrieg, that just completely neutralized the static defense France was relying on. The resources were there, sure, but the relative effectiveness of their military concept made those resources almost irrelevant in that specific matchup.
Wow. So relying on past successes or just abstract numbers is basically a recipe for disaster if you miss a crucial shift in what your competitor is doing or planning.
Precisely. And Jablonsky also stresses that power is fundamentally dynamic. It's not a fixed thing you can just store up. It's constantly shifting. Think about the immediate, dramatic change in global power after the nuclear bomb was developed. It instantly elevated the U.S. and changed risk calculations everywhere. Or look at the economic side. the control that OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, gained over oil supplies after 1973. That caused a rapid, severe shift in international power dynamics. Power factors are always being reshaped by technology, by economics, by conflict itself.
So to really get a handle on a nation's potential power, its ability to actually influence events, we need to look at the underlying factors. Jablonsky divides them into natural and social determinants. Let's start with the natural ones: geography, population, and resources.
Geography. Hugely influential. I mean, consider the strategic advantage the United States has always had because of its oceans, the Atlantic and Pacific. Those oceanic moats basically allowed it to stay out of major European conflicts for a long time and focus internally. Contrast that with, say, Poland, historically caught between powerful neighbors. Jablonsky also mentions climate historically, he notes. The world's poorest states have often been outside the temperate zones.
And physical stuff like size and terrain matter massively for defense and offense too. The classic example is Russia, right? Its sheer size allowed it to trade space for time against invaders like Napoleon or Hitler. But geography can also be a constraint. Jablonsky points out Russia's rivers mostly run north-south, which historically made east-west economic integration more difficult. Shows both the power and the complexity of geography.
Population is another big one. Its size, its trends, its structure. A large population is pretty much necessary for global power, but it's not enough on its own. You have to look at its quality education levels, health, skills. Jablonsky notes how America's rise was fueled partly by massive immigration over a century, bringing skills and labor. Conversely, think about the power shift between Germany and France in the late 19th century. Part of that was reflected in Germany's booming population versus a more stagnant French one.
And finally, natural resources. You obviously need a good supply to fuel a modern military and industrial base. But Jablonsky makes a crucial distinction here. Just having oil or iron ore isn't the same as having power. A nation needs the industrial capacity to actually develop those resources, and just as importantly, the political stability and control to decide how they're used. Think about Japan. It lacks almost all critical resources. That dependency forces it into strong alliances like with the U.S. It shows how resources immediately tie into the diplomatic instrument of power.
Okay, so moving from that natural potential to how a nation actually organizes itself, we look at the social determinants. The economic determinant is absolutely paramount. Military strength doesn't last long if it bankrupts the nation. Jablonsky points out, quite sharply, that excessive military spending, the classic example being the Soviet Union, can actually erode the foundation of national power if it harms long-term economic growth and technological progress. A strong, diverse economy provides power through trade, investment, foreign aid, and just sheer resilience.
Then there's the military determinant itself. And while we often focus on the hardware, the tanks and planes, Jablonsky stresses the intangibles: leadership quality, troop morale, unit cohesion, discipline. The poor performance of Iraqi forces in the first Gulf War, even though they had decent numbers in some areas, really showed that those intangibles, will, command structure, are often the deciding factors in actual combat. And for a global power like the U.S., power projection and sustainability, the ability to get troops and supplies thousands of miles away and keep them there, those are defining elements of military power too.
And finally, we get to the political and psychological determinants. These are arguably the hardest to measure, but maybe the most important. The efficiency, the competence, the sheer legitimacy of the government itself is vital. But the most ephemeral factor, and often the most decisive, is national will and morale. The level of determination the population and its leaders have to actually achieve the objective, whatever the cost.
This is where that famous cautionary story about the Vietnam War comes in, isn't it? As Jablonsky tells it, the story went around during the U.S. withdrawal. If you fed all the quantitative data, gross national product, manufacturing output, troop numbers, enemy casualties into a Pentagon computer, it would have spat out, "You won in 1964.
And that anecdote, whether it's completely true or not, it perfectly illustrates the strategic failure point. The quantitative factors, the superior economic and military means, they were overwhelmingly on the U.S. side. But that qualitative piece, the national will, the political determination to sustain the effort and accept the costs, that was missing, or at least insufficient on the U.S. side compared to the North Vietnamese. The inability to translate battlefield success into lasting political outcomes meant all that quantifiable power was ultimately negated by a failure of political will. That's the strategist's nightmare, really, dealing with those human, intangible aspects of power that just refuse to fit neatly into spreadsheets.
So if national power is always shifting and relative, the strategic environment itself is defined by this constant interaction. U.S. joint doctrine frames this environment as strategic competition, happening along something it calls the competition continuum.
Right, the competition continuum. It's basically a spectrum describing the ongoing, long-term interaction between different actors pursuing their interests. It ranges from cooperation at one end through competition below armed conflict in the middle, all the way to armed conflict at the other end. And we should remember, cooperation is actually necessary for almost every big military action. You need it to integrate allies and partners effectively.
And that middle ground, competition below armed conflict, that seems to be where a lot of the action is today. This is that indefinite contest for influence, for advantage, for leverage. It often involves indirect actions, maybe nonviolent, sometimes, frankly, malicious activities, what people sometimes call the gray zone. And it's often subject to more legal constraints because lethal force isn't being openly used. The goal here is to make gains without triggering a full-blown war.
And then, of course, you have armed conflict, where lethal force becomes the primary tool for imposing your will and achieving policy goals. But what's critical to understand is that cooperation and competition, they're always happening simultaneously. The only thing that really changes along that continuum is usually the presence or absence of large-scale armed conflict. Even while fighting a war in one region, nations might be cooperating on, say, global health issues or trying to maintain financial stability.
To really understand how complex and persistent this competition is, we can borrow some ways of thinking from international relations theory. Stephen McGlinchey's Foundations of International Relations outlines some useful models. These theories give strategists different lenses to view the global system.
Yeah, let's start with realism, sometimes called the pessimistic view. Realism focuses on three main ideas, often called the three S's. Statism, meaning the nation-state is the main actor, the most powerful one. Survival, meaning that ensuring security against threats is the absolute top priority for every state. And self-help, meaning because there's no world government, states ultimately have to rely on themselves for security.
That sounds like a pretty tough, zero-sum kind of world.
It often is in the realist view. Realists tend to see interactions through a zero-sum logic. It's about relative gains. So if some interaction benefits a rival state, even if it benefits you a little bit too, it can still be seen as a net loss because your rival gained ground relative to you. This makes realists naturally cautious about cooperation and very focused on the balance of power between states.
Okay, and then in stark contrast, you have liberalism, often seen as the more optimistic perspective.
Right. Liberals focus more on cooperation, on global governance through international organizations like the UN, and on the benefits of trade. They believe trade, especially, leads to positive sum outcomes, or absolute gains. In this view, if two countries both get richer through trade, it doesn't really matter if one gains slightly more. Both are better off, which reduces the reasons for conflict. Liberals also often point to democratic peace theory, the idea that mature liberal democracies very rarely, if ever, go to war with each other.
So the military strategists operating out there on the competition continuum, they can't really just pick one theory and stick with it, can they? They have to understand that the real world is usually a messy mix where both of these logics, the realist and the liberal, kind of coexist. Like you might be competing fiercely with a rival in cyberspace, a very realist zero-sum kind of struggle, while at the same time you're cooperating with them on nuclear non-proliferation, which is a clearly liberal positive-sum goal.
That dynamic tension is modern strategy in many ways. It demands a lot of intellectual flexibility to navigate effectively.
Now, when competition does escalate all the way to armed conflict, the U.S. military recognizes two general forms of warfare, and joint force commanders often blend them together: conventional and irregular warfare.
Conventional warfare is, well, what we traditionally think of as war. Violent struggle between nation-states or coalitions, usually focused on destroying the enemy's military forces and seizing key territory or strategic objectives. Doctrine also notes this includes the potential threat or use of nuclear weapons, which is why strategic nuclear deterrence demands such a high state of constant readiness.
Irregular warfare, though, that seems to reflect the complexity of modern competition much more. This involves states, but also non-state actors, campaigning to coerce or maybe assure populations, often using indirect, non-attributable, or asymmetric methods.
Exactly. This form is typically a long-term effort. It requires a whole-of-government approach, using all those instruments of national power we talked about, diplomatic, informational, military, economic. The key objectives in irregular warfare aren't just military gains. They often include things like affecting the legitimacy and influence of the main players, countering the adversary's own coercive actions, and sometimes just diverting or exhausting the opponent's resources and will over a long period. It's fundamentally about controlling the political narrative, influencing the population, not necessarily just taking ground.
And if armed conflict does happen, the ultimate goal is always political, imposing your desired policy objectives on the adversary. Joint doctrine identifies three main methods for doing this, and they're almost always used together: exhaustion, attrition, and annihilation.
Exhaustion focuses on the psychological side, eroding the enemy's will to fight, their commitment. This targets that national will factor we discussed earlier, the determination of the people and the government to keep going.
Attrition is the classic grinding down process, right?
Yeah.
Gradually reducing the enemy's physical strength, their effectiveness, by inflicting casualties, destroying equipment faster than they can replace it.
And annihilation is the most decisive method. It aims to destroy the enemy's actual means to fight, seeking to shatter their forces, break their command structure, eliminate their ability to operate as a coherent military organization. A joint force commander will rarely rely on just one. A modern campaign might aim for annihilation against, say, the enemy's main armored divisions, while simultaneously using exhaustion tactics against the enemy population's morale and attrition against their logistical support.
Okay, we've laid out the goals, the tools, the landscape, but now we have to face the reality. This strategic environment is inherently messy, it's unpredictable, often chaotic. And this leads to a really critical point that Yarger emphasizes in the little book on big strategy. Strategy is not the same thing as planning.
Yeah, that distinction is so important for anyone in a leadership position. Planning often assumes a fairly linear cause and effect path. You do step A, you expect result B. Strategy, though, is more like a continuous process of interacting with a dynamic, often chaotic environment. Yarger makes it clear. Strategy has to be proactive, it has to anticipate, try to shape the future. But it can't be predictive. You simply cannot predict the future with certainty. What you can do is build a strategy that's resilient enough, flexible enough, to cope with unpredictable change.
And those dynamics are defined by, well, massive uncertainty and friction. Joint doctrine even uses an acronym for the strategic environment, VUCA. Variable, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And this complexity means, as Yarger warns, that sometimes small changes can have effects totally out of proportion to the initial event. You get these unpredictable cascades.
This non-linearity, this unpredictability, it's exactly what the famous military theorist Clausewitz captured with his concept of friction. Friction is that gap, that inevitable difference between the perfect strategy you draw up on paper and the actual messy, difficult reality of applying it in the real world. It's that constant force that resists every action and makes even the simplest tasks hard in war and competition.
And friction comes from both physical things and human things, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Physical friction includes things like the fog of war, just not knowing what's happening, bad weather, tough terrain, or the enemy actively trying to deceive you. But the human element of friction is often even more powerful. Things like fear, exhaustion, uncertainty, poor communication between units, leadership biases, unclear objectives. The list goes on. Friction can never be totally eliminated, but it has to be constantly anticipated and managed.
So how do commanders try to minimize the impact of this friction? Joint doctrine points to things like rigorous training, adaptive doctrine, and really importantly, decentralized decision-making, what the military calls mission command.
Right. Mission command is crucial. It recognizes that the higher up the command chain you go, generally the slower the reaction time. So by giving subordinate commanders mission-type orders, orders that focus on the intent, the purpose of the mission, rather than a detailed checklist of steps, you give them the freedom and flexibility. Flexibility to adapt on the spot when friction inevitably throws up unexpected problems, like stronger enemy resistance than expected, or maybe a key bridge being destroyed.
That nonlinearity means the strategist has to kind of embrace the chaos, in a way. If you miss one small friction point, maybe a minor disruption in the supply chain, a poorly phrased statement by a politician, a critical piece of technology failing unexpectedly, it can amplify and cascade, potentially derailing the whole strategy.
All of this complexity really brings us back to Karl von Clausewitz's timeless definition of war, which is right there in joint doctrine. War is the continuation of policy by other means.
And this definition is useful because it helps separate what's constant about war from what changes. War's fundamental nature, the fact that it's a violent human activity, always involving chance, friction, uncertainty that's constant. It will always be difficult, dangerous, and fundamentally human.
But war's character, what it actually looks like, its face or form that is highly variable. It changes dramatically based on shifts in technology, economics, political goals, even social norms. And Joint Publication 1, Volume 1 explicitly states that the joint force is experiencing a fundamental change in the character of war right now. It's not something off in the future, it's happening.
Which means we can't just prepare to fight the last war over again. The doctrine actually anticipates that future joint warfighting will need a new way of war, fought by a force that does not yet exist. Wow. Guided by doctrine that's still evolving, led by leaders who need to be developed now, this future, which is already starting to take shape, seems to rely heavily on achieving information advantage, rapidly adapting new technologies, things like long-range precision strike, and building really resilient systems across all domains: land, sea, air, space, cyber.
Ultimately, though, the enduring challenge for any strategist, for any leader, isn't just winning battles or even winning the war in a purely military sense. It's successfully achieving the political objective that started it all. Joint doctrine is very clear on this. Military victory is kind of hollow, even elusive, if it doesn't translate into favorable, lasting political outcomes.
So the military can't just, pack up and go home once the shooting stops. After an armed conflict officially ends, the Joint Force commander usually has to keep campaigning, shifting into new forms of competition, to actually secure and consolidate the gains that were made. Whether the desired end state is an imposed peace settlement, or a negotiated one, or just an armistice, they have to maintain focus and resources until those final political goals are actually achieved and stable. Failing to manage that transition phase well is often where the whole strategy falls apart, historically speaking. #tag outro. Well, this deep dive has really shown the immense intellectual framework that's needed to wield national power effectively and, hopefully, responsibly. To maybe synthesize what we've covered, the political purpose always dictates the strategy. The strategy that employs and has to integrate all those instruments of power: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. The strength and effectiveness of those instruments, that comes down to the nation's underlying natural and social determinants of power, which are themselves constantly shifting. Success, it seems, depends less on just being big and strong, and more on the ability to adapt faster and smarter than your adversary in that environment that's always, variable, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous VUCA.
That strategic agility really is everything. As Yarger argues so compellingly, strategy is fundamentally about anticipating and shaping the environment, not just reacting when crises hit. The side that proves better at adapting its warfighting concepts, its capabilities, more quickly and effectively, whether that's during peacetime competition or actual armed conflict, that side almost always holds the decisive advantage. That's a point you see emphasized again and again in foundational joint doctrine like Joint Publication 1.
So for you, our listeners, something to take away and maybe mull over. Since we know the strategic environment is complex, chaotic, governed by nonlinearity, where small triggers can have huge unexpected effects, where do you think the highest leverage point might be today? Where is that smallest friction in modern competition located? If you could manipulate or target just one small area, what might create those cascading strategic effects far bigger than anticipated? That could force adversaries to react and maybe even derail their entire grand strategy. Think beyond just the battlefield. Consider things like the power of political legitimacy, or maybe the hidden fragility within complex global supply chains. Where's the leverage?